Is Mormonism a cult? I mean, genuinely. If we stop using cult as either an insult or shorthand for weird religion and look at how cult experts define control, where does Mormonism land?
Because once you start looking at research on cults, what makes a cult is more complicated than the question, could you leave if you wanted to? People can make choices inside very controlling systems. They can believe in what they're doing. They can choose it and want it.
So we went to the cult experts and put mainstream Mormonism against the actual frameworks they use.
Hannah and Jess, we got away. Now we're unpacking what they won't say. Behind temple walls and cover-ups. We're pouring tea in your coffee cups. It's the post-Mormon post-mortem. Digging up what they want forgotten. Trauma, truth, and crime, yeah, we're surviving. It's post-Mormon post-mortem.
Hello, Eternal Family. Welcome to Post-Mormon Postmortem, the podcast where we lovingly sift through the ashes of our former faith, one bizarre belief and repressed memory at a time.
We explore everything from the church's cultural weirdness and doctrinal whiplash to the deep, deep wounds of religious trauma, Mormon true crime, and the messy, glorious road to recovery.
Whether you're freshly out, years removed, or just ex-mo curious, this really is the right place. We're here to hold space, spill tea, and call out the cultish stuff hiding in plain sight. I'm your host, Hannah.
And I'm Jess.
Today we are asking, is Mormonism a cult?
Now, the first problem is that cult is a terrible word if nobody agrees on what it means. It can mean a tiny religion, a strange religion, something dangerous, something secretive. Jonestown, right? Scientology. Sometimes it stands in for, I think those people are nuts.
Makes sense. Cult experts, the people whose work we're using today, don't determine cult status based on whether the beliefs sound weird to outsiders. Oh, that immediately gets rid of one very easy Mormon argument. Because yes, Mormonism has unusual beliefs, and so do plenty of religions. Stephen Hassan says what matters is the way a group exercises control. Janja Lalich looks at authority, belief rules, and social maintenance and how those things shape the choices members make. We're using these frameworks, applying them to mainstream Mormonism, and asking whether the religion in which we were raised fits those kinds of patterns, how strongly it fits them, and where the comparison breaks down.
And we're staying with mainstream Mormonism. We don't need Warren Jeffs. We don't need the FLDS. Hassan treats those separately anyway and sees the FLDS as considerably more extreme. But we also have to leave room for variation. Mormonism can look very different from one family to another. One bishop can be awful. Another can be quite lovely. Somebody can organize nearly every decision around the church, while another person in the same ward ignores half of the rules. So the structural question survives any single person's answer. It can be tested against the pattern, not one experience. It means we can't answer it by finding one Mormon and asking whether they personally felt controlled. Stephen Hassan's question is, how much of you does the group control? So Stephen Hassan is probably the name people know best because of the bite model. He developed it after his own experience in Sun Myung Moon's Unification Church. He was 19 when he was recruited in 1974. He was at Queens College and had recently gone through a breakup and was thinking a lot about spirituality and purpose and wanted to do something meaningful with his life. Then some young people approached him in the student union, and they were friendly. They looked like students. They talked about an international community that was trying to make the world better. When he asked whether it was religious, they played that down. So he went along.
And that is relevant to Mormonism because Hassan's point is that he did feel like he was choosing all along the way. He liked the people. He liked what they appeared to care about. He kept agreeing to the next thing. And eventually, his whole life was tied up in the Moonies. He recruited for them. He fundraised. He worked enormous hours. He got very little sleep. His relationships were controlled. His eventual marriage would have been controlled by Moon. And Hassan still understood himself as someone making choices, making decisions. And that was central to his later work. The existence of choice does not tell you how free the choice was.
And so that's where he gets to bite, which stands for behavior control, information control, thought control, and emotional control. And I think the useful thing for us to do is to take each one and ask how much it actually describes Mormonism. So, behavior control. How much of Mormon life is religiously regulated?
Yeah, start with behavior. In Hassan's cult he was a part of, the level was extreme, right? He says that people could have their schedules controlled almost completely, like food and sleep would be restricted. Relationships come under group authority. Members work directly for the organization. Mainstream Mormonism doesn't usually look like that, but it does have a lot to say about how members live. The word of wisdom, tithing, sex, garments, Sabbath observance, church attendance, temple attendance, callings, missionary service, temple marriage, ordinances, the requirements for a temple recommend.
It's quite a list, right? So, Mormonism clearly has behavior control. But the harder question is at what degree? Because a religion having rules doesn't make it a cult. A Catholic has rules. A Muslim has rules. A synagogue has expectations. There are plenty of ordinary organizations out there that have rules. Hassan wants to know how much of your life the rules reach into and what happens when you don't follow them.
Yeah, and what happens when you don't follow them? Apply that to Mormonism. Tithing affects temple worthiness. Temple worthiness affects everything. Sexual behavior affects temple worthiness and church membership. Garments are tied to temple governance. The kind of marriage that you are encouraged to seek out is tied to the idea of an eternal family. A mission, whether or not to go on one. Does Mormonism fit into what cult experts call behavior control? Yes, very easily. But obviously that's just part of the cult question. Let's look at information control. Does Mormonism shape, for example, what members are supposed to trust?
So Hassan's second category is information control, as Hannah said. He looks at things like withholding information, dividing information into levels, discouraging critical material, teaching members to distrust critics or former members, and deciding which sources deserve trust. So looking at that, how does Mormonism do?
What do you think, Jess?
I think it's,
Yeah.
strong fit there.
Strong fit. Yeah. I mean, look at this list. We know the church withholds information. We know that information is divided into levels. If you have questions, it will tell you what are the sources that you are allowed to consult to answer your questions. And you're only allowed to consume faithful sources. Like, anything church endorsed, scriptures, gospel topic essays, for example. Russell Nelson has told members to stop increasing their doubts by rehearsing their doubts with others. Dallin Oaks has told young people dealing with faith-threatening questions that research isn't the answer. Strengthening faith is the answer. So, okay, that is a real, documented, institutional preference about where members are allowed to go and get information that threatens belief.
And we should also say what it doesn't do here, right? So the church doesn't maintain some blanket ban on critical books. And members have the internet. They can technically read whatever they want. But you'll see the church itself now is publishing material about the difficult parts of its history because history is so easily available.
Yeah, I mean, this question is way more than whether you feel free to trust what you read. I mean, there is a lot of information control, but you might be told that you can read whatever, but what are the consequences? I mean, the whole idea of anti-Mormon literature as a category is wild to me, right? The idea that something that could just be true is being labeled. You don't know whether the information is accurate or inaccurate, but it's just called anti-Mormon. I mean, I remember my mum saying, you have got to avoid anti-Mormon literature like the plague. This is the kind of language that she used to use. You must shun it. You must you don't go near it with a 10-foot pole. And then she said, I'll never forget her saying this because I was like, what? Who? She named somebody in the ward. I'll call her Sister Hershey. She said, Sister Hershey was exposed to anti-Mormon literature. It was probably like No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brodie or something, right? And she said, and it nearly destroyed her testimony. You must not touch it. So if you learn this truth, it will destroy your testimony. Okay, right? I mean, Satan wants to destroy your testimony, and doubt is dangerous. So you can't have physical access to information. Okay. Like, I mean, that is so paternalistic. The idea that we'll be the judge of what you need to know or don't need to know. So on information control, yes, check.
Right.
Mormonism fits. As you said, it's like less explicit than banning books, but that doesn't mean it's not as culturally powerful in shaping thought.
I agree 100%. So continuing on the bite model, we've got to move to thought control. Does Mormonism supply the interpretation of what's going on too? And to me, thought control sounds like the most melodramatic category, right? But Hassan is talking about things like loaded language, black and white thinking, thought stopping, and belief systems that come with ready-made explanations for threatening information. How much of that do we actually see in Mormonism?
I mean, multiple examples throughout. The loaded language piece, right, is obviously clearly there. So the language like this: apostate, faithful, contention, worthiness, prompting, the spirit, doubter, murmuring, speaking evil of the Lord's anointed. Every community has a language, a shared language. Okay. So in this language, it's interesting to note whether the language starts determining what an experience will mean or look like. So if you read something disturbing about church history and feel awful because you didn't know that Mormons, slaughtered hundreds of innocent people, and now you do, then that might be the spirit leaving you. You are feeling agitated because you read something against the church. That's what contention comes from the devil. So then maybe you frame it like, well, if I don't feel good, I'll just stop reading it. I'll go back to the Book of Mormon, the scriptures, and I'll pray, and then I'll feel calmer. Oh, I do feel calmer. Okay, so that calmness is the confirmation that I did the right thing by going back to the faith, right? So same information, totally different way to frame it and process it.
Yeah. And what you've just described is the structure or the system interpreting both the discomfort and the relief in a way that benefits the church. So for me, that's really where it starts to become self-reinforcing. Janja Lalich is going to become really useful later because she has a good term for systems that become very good at explaining away information that threatens them. For now, though, on Hassan's thought control category, Mormonism gives us a lot to work with. Look at emotional control. That last letter in the bite model. What are you afraid of losing when it comes to emotional control? So Hassan spends a lot of time on fear, guilt, and shame. He also talks about phobia indoctrination, where somebody learns to associate leaving or disobedience with terrible consequences.
Yeah, Hassan gives in Combating Cult Mind Control the example of a former Moonie who had been out for years. She was married and wanted children, but she was terrified to have them and couldn't really explain why. And then eventually she remembered that she had once been taught that if somebody betrayed the Messiah and left the movement, their children would be stillborn. So even though she no longer believed Moon was the Messiah, the fear survived the belief. And that is what Hassan is getting at. I mean, it becomes in your nervous system.
Right. So bring that back to Mormonism. What are the consequences attached to leaving the church or even just disobedience?
I mean, we know that there's some large things, right? Large consequences for that decision if you leave. Exaltation, marriage, eternal life, family, worthiness, you're standing with God, right? So, I mean,
Right.
the word apostasy and the way that it's used in Mormon teaching is also loaded, right? Well, another loaded language, right? I mean, apostasy equals extremely terrifying situation of darkness and misery and spiritual danger. I think of the scripture like it's better for a man to have a millstone hung around his neck and be dumped into the bottom of the sea than for him to apostatize, right? That is what we're taught.
It is.
I mean, historical rhetoric about apostasy is pretty extreme, and the current church material has obviously made an effort to soften that. You know, we know from the temple covenants being, the temple endowment being changed, for example, but the basic doctrinal stakes, none of that has changed. None of that's changed. So leaving means you have walked away from your exaltation.
It does. Yeah. And even though somebody may have stopped believing this intellectually, that physical reaction, that old reaction can remain. Someone can stop believing garments protect them and still feel strange taking them off. They can decide tithing isn't a commandment and still feel guilty about keeping the money. They can reject prophetic authority and still feel physically anxious criticizing a prophet. Now, that doesn't apply to everyone. When it does happen, Hassan has a framework for understanding why the emotion might outlast the belief. And I hope she doesn't mind. I don't think she will. But it made me really stop and think about my sister. So, my sister stopped attending years before she stopped wearing garments. She knew she
Mm,
didn't believe in the church anymore, but she wore them anyway.
mm,
And when she finally took them off, she didn't throw them away.
mm,
She folded them up, kept them in the closet for a couple more years before she could actually feel brave enough to get rid of them. And she told me she didn't wear them for so long because she thought that they protected her. She just carried this inner
mhm,
fear about what it meant to throw them out
mhm,
because she'd been taught their importance and she was so afraid of the potential consequence, even though intellectually
mhm.
she had divorced herself from the church.
Yeah, I think we can't underestimate the power
Mhm.
of the emotional piece, right? And cults know that. So if we check in here on how Mormonism is doing, has a pretty solid showing on all four parts of the bite model: behavior, information, thought, and emotion. Okay, now, interestingly, is how Hassan's thinking has developed on Mormonism. He writes that initially, Mormonism has such a good veneer and a facade of appearing so wholesome and worthy that it never occurred to him that it would have cult characteristics until he started talking to former Mormons. And he writes in Combating Cult Mind Control that he has subsequently rethought, right? He has now learned enough about, he basically says, I didn't know enough about Mormonism before. Now I know how it operates. Yes, of course, it meets all these criteria. And that is where Tom Hopkins comes in.
But before we get to Tom, This episode took a stack of books, a full review of the bite model, read through of all of Bounded Choice, and plus what Hannah and I have actually lived through. And if that kind of digging is worth something to you, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the show notes. And Patreon gives you the full source list, every citation, every place we pulled the claim from, so you can check our work yourselves. So back to Tom Hopkins. Tom Hopkins spent his life as a very committed Mormon. He grew up active. At 16, he was already serving as an assistant to the bishop and proselytizing. He served a mission in Thailand and says he averaged at least one convert baptism a month. After his mission, he converted and baptized the woman he later married, and they had 4 children. Over the years, he served as a gospel doctrine teacher, scoutmaster, a high priest, bishopric counselor, Sunday school counselor, and a member of a stake mission presidency. He was a home teacher. He paid tithing and gave other donations. Mormonism was deeply embedded in his life.
He did it all, wow. And he had questions. Certain doctrines bothered him. He read apologetics. He assumed answers existed and he would understand them eventually. Oh, we've all been there. Tom. He says that he learned the church represented what was good and true, and opposition to that was false and evil and ultimately led to unhappiness. Then, in his late 20s, one of his guitar students told him things about the church that, quite frankly, frightened him. The student was a lawyer and a former missionary. So some of the information Tom already knew, and some of it was brand new to him. Enough of it seemed credible, though, that he went home and cried. For the first time, he seriously considered the church might not be true.
And then he did something that I think is incredibly important for this episode. He put the questions away for about 15 years. He responded to threatening information by strengthening his testimony. He prayed. He studied. He attended church and the temple. He did the things Mormonism gives members for dealing with weak faith or faith crises.
And from inside Mormonism, that makes complete sense. If you believe the church is true, then of course you strengthen your relationship with God when doubt shows up. Hassan looks at the same sequence and asks whether the system itself had taught Tom how to respond to information that threatened it. Thomas says his life became increasingly tied up with feelings of worthiness or lack of, guilt, repentance, and the need to be obedient. Eventually, he returned to his original questions. And this time, he investigated them and came to a super different conclusion about the church.
So Hassan includes Tom when he discusses mainstream Mormonism. He also attended an ex-Mormon Foundation conference in 2008 and heard former members talk about their experiences. And that included Ken Clark, who had spent 27 years working in the church educational system before leaving. And Hassan has since described Mormonism directly as an authoritarian cult.
If the question is, does Stephen Hassan think the bite model applies to mainstream Mormonism? The answer is yes. Yes, he does. It doesn't magically turn, bite into a clinical test where Mormonism scores 72 and cult begins at 68. It's obviously not quite like that. But yeah, the judgment is that Mormonism, of course, fills those criteria. And that brings us to Janja Lalich, who we talked about at the beginning of the episode, because her work gets to a different part of how cults operate. So she asks, what if you really did choose it?
Lalich spent years inside the Democratic Workers' Party, which was a rigid Marxist political organization, and she later became a sociologist studying cultic systems. In her book, Bounded Choice, she compares that group with Heaven's Gate. And that kind of sounds bizarre until you see what she's comparing.
Heaven's Gate was the UFO group, 39 members, died in 1997, believing, and when I say died, took their own lives, believing they were going to leave their human bodies and reach a spacecraft associated with the Halley-Bopp comet. The Democratic Workers' Party was a hardline Marxist organization. No UFOs there or spacecrafts, totally different belief system. But Lalich found similar structures underneath.
She did. She identifies 4 pieces working together: charismatic authority, a transcendent belief system, systems of control, and systems of influence. And if we're testing Mormonism, the first 2 are pretty easy. The church has a sacred authority structure headed by a prophet. It also has an enormous belief system explaining premortal life, mortality, death, resurrection, priesthood, exaltation, and humanity's relationship with God. So Mormonism has the authority and the worldview pieces.
Then we get to systems of control and systems of influence. Control is the formal structure, rules and requirements and procedures and discipline. And then influence is the social world around all of that. It's how we're socialized, our friends and parents and leaders and teachers and romantic partners and all the belonging and praise and expectation of our culture. And I think Mormonism becomes much easier to understand from that cultural lens. Take missions, right? There is an institutional expectation that young men, especially, like particularly, will serve a mission. But once you add parents and their expectations, grandparents, your young men's leaders, your bishop and bishopric and what they tell you, why aren't your papers in yet? I mean, primary songs are the missionary farewell talks that are given, and then the homecoming talks as well. Your patriarchal blessing probably talks about you going on a mission. You've got your friends opening their mission calls. Okay, so in such a circumstance, do you need to be ordered to go on a mission? No, nobody might need order a young man to do something like that, considering the environment in which he grew up in. His whole Mormon life up to that point already had the direction, like marked out.
Yeah. And Lalich would still call that a choice. That's the really important part. Bounded choice doesn't mean the person didn't choose. It means belief, relationships, fear, loyalty, obligation, and the rules around them have shaped the field in which the choice gets made. So, temple marriage is a choice. Tithing is a choice. Garments are a choice. A mission is a choice. The fact that somebody chose those things doesn't tell us everything about why those options felt right and what the alternatives meant.
Yeah, it's like if someone's like, no one forced you to do something, right? If you have made a choice and, the response is nobody forced you to do so, it's like, well, that's rather irrelevant because you don't need people to force you to do something. A system can work very well when you sincerely want what it is that you have been taught to want, right? You are the product of the socialization that was worked on you. Does love and belonging count as control?
Well, there's another part of Lalich's work that matters for Mormonism because she does allow for members to have genuinely good experiences that, that sense of love and belonging might bring. It
Right.
seems obvious, but it changes the analysis to me.
I mean, yeah, we have established that, there are wards where they'll show up for someone when their life falls apart. There are families like the Smarts, where I was just saying, like, they seem like good, loving parents, right? So obviously, it goes without saying that in a system, you can feel like deeply connected to your family that are part of that religion. And those experiences are totally real. We're not invalidating any of them.
No. But all of those good things, all of that realness can really increase the cost of leaving. If the
That's
church
it.
is where your closest relationships live, where your family identity lives, where your sense of purpose lives, then the departure from the church carries a lot more weight. Friendships within are real, but they're also a source of influence, especially the relationships or those friendships that aren't in tension with your intent to leave.
Right. And that, Jess, is key to this understanding. In my opinion, Mormon control often comes through people who do sincerely care about you. Okay, so let's assume that my mother genuinely loves me. Okay, she can pressure me to return to church because she genuinely believes that my whole eternal soul is at stake. My bishop can push me towards something, like to go on a mission or whatever. And they might do so with the genuine understanding and belief that they are helping you.
Mhm.
Just like if you, I see it all the time on ex-Mormon Reddit. If you stop believing and your spouse doesn't, then your spouse might panic to learn that you feel differently than you did before. So people are not setting out to try to control others. They are operating in a system that produces an immense amount of pressure to conform. I mean, Jess, this is about as personal as it gets, I think, for you and I, because we were both born into Mormon families.
Mhm.
We were baptized when we were 8, but Mormonism was the world that we grew up in and the world that we were born into. And in that sense, I mean, was there a choice? It was just always there, right? I
No,
mean,
that's the world that I lived in. I mean, there
yeah.
wasn't a choice.
I mean, you might have thought you were making a choice when you were 8 to get baptized, but what kind of choice is that, right?
Right.
Like,
Were you really going to tell your dad, no, I'm not
yeah,
doing that?
exactly.
Not
If
when you're 8.
And so, yes, we all make choices, right? Like, we might choose to go and work in a job we hate rather than not be able to pay our bills. I think it's interesting because Stephen Hassan, he talks about being recruited to the Moonies when he was 19. And so his family life and upbringing in that was like, he had this whole pre-cult years of
Mhm.
experience. Then he talks about this layers of shame that come along with choosing it in a different way, right? Because we can say, hey, I didn't choose this. This was forced upon
Right.
me.
I was just
Yeah.
into it.
But alternatively, when he left a cult, he has an earlier self, an earlier identity that he can reconnect with and get back in touch with.
Mhm.
So what he started hearing from people who had been raised inside high control religions was like, there isn't a before for me to return to. If I get out of
Yeah.
this, who am I?
Yeah. So Lalich and Tobias make the same distinction. Someone recruited as an adult has an existing worldview that, is available to them for comparison. But a child like Hannah and I doesn't. And being raised religious clearly doesn't make religion a cult. That's not what I'm saying. Every family teaches children what it believes. The useful question is, what kind of environment was the child raised inside?
Mm. Yeah, I remember in undergrad, I think it was a political science class, and being given a list of cult characteristics, and I had never seen something that so perfectly fit Mormonism, and also I had never considered that Mormonism would align with these characteristics, right? And one of them was, are children in this system taught to make pronouncements of truth about things that they could not possibly know? A Mormon child
Hmm.
learns before they are old enough to know what they are saying. I know the church is true. I know Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. I know the Book of Mormon is the true word of God. I know that I can live in heaven again with, whatever it is, right?
All
Like
of the things.
the
Yeah.
road, exactly. But it always begins with, I know the church
The
is true.
church is
Well, what
true.
does the word know
Mhm.
mean then? What is knowledge if a child who cannot examine a truth claim, who has no evidentiary basis,
Right.
right? Like, I know Spencer W. Kimball is a prophet of God, right? Like, that was one of the other things that you are saying that you do not know. And then, as we said, when you're 8 and you're asked whether you choose to get baptized, yes, you choose. I choose to make a choice in the world that the adults have built for me, where my family system,
this is the expectation. Yes.
where my very survival depends on me making the right choices.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that is bounded choice.
So for somebody born Mormon, bounded choice starts much earlier than deciding whether to serve a mission or get married in the temple, as Hannah just eloquently walked us through, right? The worldview itself comes first, and then each later choice gets made inside it. Just look at the pathway: youth, worthiness, a patriarchal blessing, then dating, then a mission, then the temple, then marriage, children, callings. So by adulthood, somebody may have made hundreds of Mormon choices without ever having made one initial adult choice to become Mormon.
If any part of this has named something for you, just send it to one person, someone who just got out or someone who has not got the words for what happened to them, and hit subscribe. Hopefully the next one will land the same way this one did. So what makes informed consent is an interesting question around cults, right? It's one of the most interesting cult questions to me. And if we're asking whether the system shapes what choices seem possible, being born into it, that matters enormously. Because how does Mormonism handle doubt or dissent is
Right.
key.
Yeah, that's really another way to test a high control system, right? It's to ask what happens when somebody stops agreeing. Oh boy, does Mormonism give us a formal answer here. So the current general handbook includes repeated, clear, and deliberate public opposition to the church, its doctrine, policies, or leaders. Well, that's all apostasy. And that can become a matter of whether that person maintains their membership.
And we've talked before about how really for the church, the thing they hate is the public part of it, right? It's like you're allowed your doubts, but you are not allowed to express them
not
publicly.
open your mouth, right?
Yeah. You're allowed to privately, internally disagree with something a leader has said, but you may not repeat the opposition in public. There is no room for disagreement. Okay? I mean, think about that in terms of cult systems.
Right.
And there's a boundary that once someone has crossed it, the church can respond by restricting your membership, taking or, hauling you in front of a disciplinary council. We've talked about this before, how the church has dealt with any perceived speaking out or criticism of it, right? They frame apostasy as a spiritual threat to other people. Like you may contaminate them. So these cases have to be dealt with to protect everybody.
I want to look at this. What is the handbook saying on apostasy? There are certain cases where you need to promptly act to protect others. I mean, that gives us something fairly concrete to look at. If a religion claims divine authority and then reserves the right to discipline members for sustained public opposition to that authority, well, that belongs in a discussion about control. Again, the single fact doesn't make the church a cult. It fits a broader pattern we've already been describing.
All right, then we get to the test that pulls all of this together. Can you leave Mormonism? Yes, very obviously. You can stop attending.
Right?
You can resign. Former Mormons can start podcasts. We have tested this.
Been there, done that. If physical exit is the only standard, well, that's easy. But the researchers that we're referencing and using here care about what leaving means inside the system. What does the person think they're losing? What happens socially? What happens psychologically? What parts of the belief system keep operating afterward? Think back to my sister and the garments, right?
Right. Yeah, I think in Mormonism, there's a lot on one side of that decision, like family and marriage and community and, culture and covenants and just all of it, right? The church has published material for members who are afraid about what a loved one leaving means for their eternal family. Like an article with a woman worrying about just that after her brother leaves, and then the advice she gets is kind, like just love him anyway and stay close. And we should say that because Mormon families are not officially instructed to shun anyone who leaves. And thank goodness.
Not officially.
No, yeah, I mean, that's not been my experience, but I know so many people who have had that unofficial experience.
Yeah. So the fear can exist even when everyone behaves lovingly, like even when, as Hannah said, not every family shuns members who have left. My family is more in the bell curve of families that do. You can love your child completely and believe that they have walked away from the covenants expected to exaltation. A spouse can worry and wonder what loss of faith means for an eternal marriage, and parents can worry about a child's eternal future. The person who is leaving can and does know that all of those thoughts and concerns are happening around them.
Yeah. And this is where I'm thinking about the messages, the posts on ex-Mormon Reddit that encompass this.
Multiple times a day.
Yeah. Hassan's phobia material and Janja Lalich's bounded choice ideas, they connect here. So leaving, okay, you have a choice. The door is open. Nobody's imprisoning you in this religion, but the consequences are enormous. So yes, you can leave and accept the consequences and deal with the consequences. Like, what else are you going to do? So it's the weight of those consequences that makes it a choice or not, right? Like, yeah, you can leave. Your family will never talk to you again.
So Lalich and her co-author Tobias, they spent a lot of time on former members, and they're really careful about variation. Right. Some people leave and adjust relatively quickly. I mean, that was me. Some struggle for years. Some people miss parts of the group and they keep parts of their belief system. Some people need to rebuild their identity and relationships. Sometimes they even need to rebuild basic confidence in their own judgment.
Yeah, for sure. Right? Like, if you have learned to override and disregard your gut, that takes undoing, right? For someone born into Mormonism, there is no earlier version of yourself pre-Mormonism out there for you to return to. So you can leave at 40, for example, and suddenly find yourself for the first time in your life making ordinary decisions without Mormonism giving you the answers first.
Right.
Like, should I drink or not? And how much to drink? I mean, what clothes to wear? What am I going to do on Sunday? How am I going to spend my money? Should I be having sex? What about death? How you feel about yourself and think about yourself. There is an amazing amount of work involved in finding out what you think when the answer isn't supplied for you anymore. I mean, I've mentioned this before, but to me, one of the most damaging aspects of being raised Mormon was the realization when I left a highly controlling relationship with an abusive person, and I was deep in, self-recrimination. I'm such an idiot. How could I be so stupid? I can't believe I didn't see that coming from a mile away. And the idea came into my head very clearly. I suddenly had an understanding. Yes, you were perfectly primed to ignore what you knew was right. Because I had the experience of having the conscious thought, this is not good for me. This is not good for me. I need to be here. And because I had then overrode that and carried on regardless, it felt like I'd had a lifetime of practice doing that.
Yeah.
Because I had.
Indeed. Yeah. We've talked about that before, and it just it lands right in the chest every time you talk to me about it. Because, it makes perfect sense when you look at it that way. And And I'm not suggesting that for everyone who's left Mormonism or a high control religion, that your experience is going to be the same as Hannah's, or that you may find that you have all of this work to do in reshaping your identity or your sense of self. I am saying it tells us something important when that does happen. If leaving an organization requires rebuilding a worldview and a sense of self, that says something about how much territory the organization occupied in your life and in your definition of self.
Yeah, in who you were allowed to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, hey, stranger, there you are. That's how I felt. It was like, oh, hey, like it's you.
It's you. Well,
We've never met.
and I think of the many women we work with in our coaching practice who are like, first time I looked in the mirror and realized I was deciding for myself, and how profound and also frightening that was for so many of them.
Yeah, we don't have a lot of practice with that.
Right. So at this point, Hannah and I have tested Mormonism against quite a lot. Hassan gives us the BITE model, the behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. And we've stepped through it. Mormonism has clear examples in all four. Lalich gives us this additional perspective, right? We have to think about special authority, a complete belief system, formal control, and social influence. Mormonism has all four of those too. So we've got a religion that can begin shaping identity from childhood. It has formal boundaries about public opposition, and it attaches very serious spiritual meaning to leaving.
So, calling Mormonism a high control religion is extremely easy to defend. In my opinion, calling Mormonism a cult is also easy to defend because while research doesn't give us the agreed one definition, and believe me, I mean, anytime you talk about, whether Mormonism is a cult or not online or anything about Mormonism, there are people who love to shout cult. And it's like, yeah, I know.
Hello, we got it. Yeah.
Because I'm looking at the requirements. Exactly. It's like, call it banana, call it plastic tub, call it tree. It doesn't matter what you call it. It's how it operates, right? Remember that list I said I was given in undergrad? Do children make pronouncements about truth claims that they couldn't possibly know?
Right.
Are the stakes of leaving tied to your identity? And yes, the experience of Mormonism will be different because it's like such a huge institution with so many people coming from their own like wildly different places of commitment and how their upbringing differed and control. But overall.
Yeah. Well, it means somebody can look at everything that we've just gone through and they can decide, well, I'm happier, I'm more comfortable with the term high control religion. That's more useful to me because they want to shy away from
It might feel more
the term
accurate.
cult. Right. And using that, if you're doing that, if you're deciding that high control religion is more useful to you, that doesn't require that you deny the evidence that we've covered.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously perfectly comfortable landing on the idea that Mormonism, it occupies so many checks on that checklist of the cultic characteristics. So Steve Hassan, as I said, initially he was like, Mormonism, what? No. And then talking to Mormons about what their life was actually like. Oh no, we weren't allowed to ask questions. We were told to doubt our doubts. We were told to put them on a shelf and not think about them. Well, no, we weren't encouraged to go and, read outside literature. No, we weren't encouraged to speak to someone who maybe used to be a member of the church and had their own questions and see where they land. Hassan said the more he learned about Mormonism, the more he realized like, oh yeah, Mormonism lands there.
It does.
And that Lalich framework, right? So again, the word is the label, but I'm interested in the person's reality, right? Like the life that you end up inhabiting that nobody had to physically force you to do because you believe it, right? Because you were raised in it, because you were shaped by it, because you sincerely want everything it offers or claims to offer. And you can make real choices within it. But the bigger question I'm left with is how much of the world around those choices was built for you and how much did you choose?
Yeah, and I think that's probably where I want to leave the research part of it, because the word cult can become an argument all by itself.
Yeah,
I think it
for sure.
definitely has within my family. I think my sister slings it at my dad, and he is impervious to reason or logic, so it's never going to
Well,
land.
yeah, and plus it feels, feels harsh, right, to the person on the receiving end of it. You're in a cult means you don't know how to think for yourself.
So by leaving the research, for me, I think the structures become easier to see. Like, how much authority does the church have in your life? How much behavior does it regulate? How does the church handle threatening information? How does the church respond to public dissent? What does leaving cost? Those questions don't depend on whether everybody agrees on the label of cult.
Right. I mean, we know from our own experience that they don't. And that's why, as I said, I'll use the label. But the really interesting conversation is like, okay, cult, not a cult, who cares? Let's talk about, like you said, what did you say, Jess? The mechanism, the structures, like
The
within
structures,
it. Yeah. What is happening? But that you have to have lived, right? Like, I know it, you know it, we've lived it. It's harder to describe if you haven't experienced it.
Agree. And for sure, I use the word cult too. To be honest, sometimes it's not easy because my parents are so deeply in it. And that is one of the primary reasons for our estrangement and the way it has destroyed the relationships between the siblings in my family. And also because I know it's a cult, it also helps me understand why the church comes before me and my siblings for my parents. They love the church more than us. And it's not because they don't love us. It's because the church, the cult requires that ranking. And my parents said yes a long time ago.
Yeah, they really do require it. They tell you. I mean, my parents are like, you wouldn't want parents who, loved you more than they loved each other or loved you more than they loved God. It's like, yes, I would.
Yes, I would, actually. And I've tried to be that kind of parent.
Right, exactly. No, I would like a parent who prioritizes me above a fucking church. Thank you.
And I can hear, I can already read the comments on this part of the episode, but I'm not being dramatic. This is my lived experience. I believe it is yours as well, Hannah. And it is the lived experience of, I can't even guess how many others. You can see them in our comments, in our socials. You can see them in our coaching practice. You can see them in our conversations and the things we read. I'm saying this through years of research, everything we just walked through, plus every message that we get from a listener, from a follower, telling us the same version of the same thing. I think it's a cult. And I think that word is the only one that actually accounts for what it cost some of us.
Wow. Right on. Couldn't agree more.
Well, thanks, Hannah. Well, that's all we have for you today. Thank you for listening. As always, if you want to find us on the socials, we're out there at postmormonpostmortem.com and Postmormon Postmortem on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, all of the places. We're there.
We are there. We look forward to seeing you there. We appreciate you listening. Thank you to Dr. Dave for the guitar music. Thank you to Pete for editing, to Hannah W. for the vocals. Oh, and Mick for the theme song editing.
So many people to thank, and all of this hard work really is a labor of love at this point. If you want to support the show, you can find us on Patreon and buy me a coffee.
Yeah.
And Hannah, before we sign off for today, I gotta say, I'm so sorry for what I said when I was Mormon.
Oh, dude. Me too. I'm sorry for what I said when I was Mormon also.